Have you ever wondered what kind of person could smile at you in the morning, share a meal with you at noon, and then lock their own children in darkness by night? In 1907, a boarding house in Chicago revealed a secret so twisted that even hardened police officers refused to speak of it for years. What happened in that basement wasn't just murder. It was something far worse. Something that proved monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they serve you breakfast. Before we go further, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another story that'll make you question everything. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to a cold October in Chicago, when the truth about the Harrigan house finally came screaming into the light. I wasn't supposed to be at the Harrigan boarding house that October morning in 1907. I was a delivery boy for Morton's Grocery, barely 16, and my usual route took me past the nicer homes on Ashland Avenue. But Thomas, the regular delivery man, had taken ill with pneumonia, and Mr. Morton handed me a list of addresses I'd never seen before. The Harrigan place was the last one, tucked at the end of Racine Street, where the cobblestones gave way to mud and the gas lights seemed dimmer somehow. The house itself wasn't remarkable. A 3-story brick building with peeling white trim and windows that reflected the gray sky like dead eyes. I remember the smell hit me first, even before I reached the front steps. It was sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit left too long in the sun, mixed with something chemical that burned the back of my throat. I figured it was just the meatpacking plants a few blocks over. The whole neighborhood reeked most days. But this was different. This smell had weight to it, like it was clinging to your clothes, working its way into your skin. I knocked 3 times on the heavy oak door, my breath misting in the cold air. I could hear movement inside, footsteps that seemed too slow, too deliberate. When the door finally opened, Frederick Harrigan stood there with that smile of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes. He was a big man, maybe 40 years old, with thick arms from working at the steel factory, and a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. His work clothes were clean despite the early hour, and his hands, when he reached for the delivery crate, were scrubbed pink. Looking back now, I should have noticed how clean everything about him was. Too clean, like he spent every spare moment washing away something only he could see. He took the crate without a word, just that smile, and I expected him to close the door, but he didn't. He stood there, blocking the entrance, watching me with eyes that seemed to be calculating something. Then he spoke, and his voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He asked if I'd like to come in for a moment, warm up, before heading back out into the cold. Said his wife had fresh coffee on the stove. I should have said no. Every instinct I had screamed at me to make some excuse and leave. But I was 16 and stupid, and the wind was picking up, cutting through my thin coat like it wasn't even there. So I nodded, and Frederick Harrigan's smile grew wider as he stepped aside to let me in. The moment I crossed that threshold, the smell intensified. It wasn't just stronger, it changed, became more specific. Beneath the sweetness and the chemical tang, there was something else, something that reminded me of the time a rat had died in the walls of our apartment and we couldn't find it for 3 weeks. The front hall was dimly lit, with wallpaper that might have been cream-colored once but had yellowed with age and smoke. A narrow staircase led upward into deeper shadow, and to my left, a doorway opened into what looked like a sitting room. Frederick led me past that room, down a corridor that seemed to stretch longer than the outside of the house suggested it should. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and somewhere above us, I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Frederick didn't react to the noise, just kept walking with that same measured pace until we reached the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen was surprisingly bright, with sunlight struggling through lace curtains that covered a window overlooking a small, dead garden. A wood stove radiated heat in one corner, and a woman stood beside it, stirring something in a pot. This was Margaret Harrigan, Frederick's wife, and the first thing I noticed about her was how thin she was. Not naturally slender, thin in the way that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights. Her dress hung loose on her frame, and her hair, pulled back in a tight bun, had started to gray despite her looking no older than 30. When she turned to face me, I saw the bruises, faded yellow, green marks on her wrists, like fingerprints pressed too hard into soft clay. A darker shadow along her jawline that makeup couldn't quite hide. She didn't speak, didn't even look at me directly. Just ladled coffee into a chipped mug and set it on the table with hands that trembled slightly. Frederick told her to fetch some bread, and she moved immediately, almost mechanically, to a cupboard near the sink. I sat at the table because standing seemed more awkward, and I wrapped my cold hands around the mug, trying to ignore the way Margaret flinched every time Frederick shifted his weight. The coffee was weak and bitter, but it was warm, and I drank it while Frederick asked me questions about the delivery route, about Mr. Morton, about nothing important really. Just filling the silence with words while his wife cut thick slices of bread with a knife that looked too sharp, too well maintained. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound from somewhere below us, like something heavy being dragged across a concrete floor. Then a soft thump, rhythmic and insistent. Frederick's smile never wavered, but I saw his jaw tighten. Margaret's hands froze mid-cut, and for just a moment I saw her eyes widen with something that looked like pure terror. Then, the moment passed. Frederick laughed, a forced sound that didn't match the tension suddenly thick in the room, and said it was just the coal bin settling, that the delivery man had overfilled it last week, and the coal kept shifting around. I nodded, like that made sense. Even though the sound hadn't been anything like coal settling, it had been deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone tapping. I finished my coffee faster than I meant to, suddenly desperate to leave. I mumbled my thanks and stood, and Frederick walked me back down that too-long hallway to the front door. As I stepped out into the cold October air, he called after me. Said if I ever needed extra work, he could use help around the house. Said he paid fair wages for strong backs and closed mouths. I didn't answer, just raised my hand in what might have been a wave and hurried away from that house as fast as I could without running. I told myself I was being foolish, that the smell was from the factories, that the sound was probably exactly what Frederick said it was, that the look in Margaret's eyes was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just escaped something, that if I'd stayed 5 minutes longer, 10 minutes longer, I might have seen or heard something that would have changed everything. I didn't know then that I was right. I didn't know that beneath my feet, in a basement I hadn't even known existed, 3 children were living in conditions that would make the city's worst tenements look like palaces. 3 weeks passed before I returned to the Harrigan house, and it wasn't by choice. Mr. Morton's regular delivery man, Thomas, had recovered from his pneumonia only to quit without notice, running, off to work on the railroads out west like half the young men in Chicago seemed to be doing. That left me with the extended route again, including Racine Street. I'd tried to talk Mr. Morton into skipping the Harrigan delivery, making up some excuse about the road being bad or the house being too far out of the way, but he'd given me that look of his, the one that said he knew exactly what I was doing and wasn't having any of it. So on a gray morning in early November, I found myself walking up those same steps, carrying a crate of supplies that seemed heavier than it should have been. The smell was worse this time, much worse. It hit me when I was still 10 feet from the door, so strong it made my eyes water. I covered my nose with my sleeve and knocked, expecting Frederick to answer with that terrible smile of his. Instead, the door opened to reveal Margaret. She looked worse than before. The bruises had multiplied, spreading up her arms and across her collarbone where her collar had shifted. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles, and when she saw me, something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or desperation, or both. She took the crate quickly, her hands shaking so badly I thought she might drop it, and started to close the door. But then, she stopped. She glanced over her shoulder, back into the dark interior of the house, and when she looked at me again, her lips moved. No sound came out at first, just air. Then, barely a whisper, so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "Help them." Before I could respond, before I could even process what she'd said, a hand appeared on her shoulder. Frederick's hand, his fingers digging into her thin frame hard enough that I saw her wince. He pulled her back from the door, apologizing, in that soft voice of his, saying his wife wasn't feeling well, that she sometimes got confused, said things that didn't make sense. He took the crate from her and handed me the payment, exact change, and closed the door firmly. But not before I saw the tears streaming down Margaret's face and the way Frederick's other hand had disappeared into the shadows of the house, gripping something I couldn't see. I stood on that porch for a full minute after the door closed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Help them. Help who? The children. He had to have children, didn't he? That's what she meant, but I'd never seen any children around the house, never heard them playing in the yard or leaving for school. In a neighborhood where kids seemed to spill out of every doorway, where you couldn't walk 10 feet without dodging someone's son or daughter, the Harrigan house stood silent and empty, or so it had seemed. I thought about going to the police. I really did. But what would I tell them? That a woman had whispered 2 words at me? That a house smelled bad in a neighborhood full of factories? That I had a feeling something was wrong? They'd laugh me out of the station if they bothered to listen at all. The police in that part of Chicago had bigger problems than the paranoid concerns of a delivery boy. So I did nothing. I walked back to Morton's grocery. I made my other deliveries, and I tried to forget the look in Margaret's eyes. But I couldn't. That night, I barely slept, tossing in my narrow bed while images of the Harrigan house played through my mind. The 2 clean hands, the flinching, the sound from below the kitchen. Help them. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going back to that house, but not during the day, not when Frederick might be there. I knew he worked at the steel factory, knew he left early in the morning and didn't return until after dark. If I could get inside during the day, talk to Margaret alone, maybe I could figure out what was really happening. It took me 3 more days to work up the courage. 3 days of delivering to every house on Racine Street except the Harrigan place, making excuses to Mr. Morton about why I couldn't go back there. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon when the sky hung low and gray with the promise of snow, I left work early, telling Mr. Morton I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't entirely a lie. I made my way to Racine Street just as the factory whistles blew for the afternoon shift. I knew Frederick would be at work for at least another 4 hours. The street was nearly empty, most people driven inside by the cold and the wind that came howling off Lake Michigan. I approached the house slowly, trying to look casual, like I had every reason to be there. The smell was always there now. So pervasive, I'd started to smell it in my dreams. I knocked on the door, softer than usual, and waited. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out Margaret's name. Still, nothing. I tried the handle, not really expecting it to turn, and felt my stomach drop when it did. The door swung open silently, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I should have left then. Should have run straight to the police station and dragged them back with me. Consequences be damned. But I thought of Margaret's face, of those whispered words, and I stepped inside. The house was silent, not peaceful. Silent in the way abandoned buildings are silent, with an emptiness that feels wrong. I called out again, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness, and got no answer. I moved through the front hall, past the sitting room with its covered furniture and drawn curtains, and made my way to the kitchen. It was empty. The stove was cold. No breakfast dishes in the sink. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there that morning. But on the table, I found something that made my blood run cold. A child's shoe. Small, for a girl maybe 6 or 7 years old, worn at the heel and crusted with something dark. I picked it up with shaking hands, and that's when I heard it again. That sound from below. But this time, it wasn't just thumping. This time, I heard voices, children's voices, thin and weak, calling for their mother. The basement. There had to be a basement. I searched the kitchen frantically, looking for a door I'd missed on my first visit. I found it behind a tall cabinet that had been pushed against the wall. A narrow door with a heavy bolt lock on the outside. The bolt was drawn back, left open. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. The door opened with a creak that seemed deafening in the quiet house, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness so complete it seemed solid. The smell that rolled up from below was indescribable. It was rot and waste and chemicals and something else. Something human. I gagged, pressing my sleeve against my face, and forced myself to take the first step down. The stairs were wooden, old and creaking under my weight. I had no light, but thin slivers of daylight filtered through gaps in the foundation, just enough to see vague shapes in the gloom. As my eyes adjusted, the shapes became clearer, and I felt my knees go weak. The basement wasn't large, maybe 15 feet by 20, with a low ceiling I could almost touch, but every inch of it was horrifying. The walls were bare brick, wet with condensation and something else, something that glistened darkly in the dim light. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained, and scattered across that floor were blankets, thin and filthy, and 3 small figures huddled beneath them. I stumbled down the last few stairs and fell to my knees beside the nearest bundle. A girl, maybe 8 years old, looked up at me with eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. Her hair was matted, her clothes little more than rags, and her skin was pale as paper. When she saw me, she didn't cry out or try to run. She just stared, like she'd forgotten how to react to another human being. The other 2 children were the same. A boy, slightly older, and another girl, younger, all of them thin to the point of starvation, all of them covered in bruises and sores. I asked them their names, and the oldest boy answered in a voice rough from disuse. He said his name was Thomas Harrigan, that his sisters were Anne and Mary. He said their father kept them down here because they were bad, because they made too much noise, because they asked for things they didn't deserve. He said this like it was normal, like all children lived in basements and saw their mother only when she could sneak down with scraps of food. I asked him how long they'd been down there, and he looked confused by the question, like the concept of time had become meaningless in the dark. He said they used to live upstairs, back when they were little, but then Father said they had to come down here to learn to be quiet. He thought maybe it had been 2 winters, maybe 3. The younger girl, Mary, started to cry then. Not loud sobs, but a quiet whimpering that was somehow worse. She said she was hungry, that Mother hadn't come since yesterday, that Father had locked the door and they couldn't get out. I told them I was going to help them, that I was going to get them out of there, and even as I said it, I heard the front door open above us, heard heavy footsteps in the hallway, heard Frederick Harrigan's voice calling out for his wife. I've never moved so fast in my life. I grabbed the youngest girl, Mary, and pulled her toward the stairs, whispering urgently for the other 2 to follow. Thomas picked up Anne, who seemed too weak to walk on her own, and we started climbing. The footsteps above had stopped moving. Frederick was standing somewhere in the house, listening. I could feel him listening. Could almost picture him standing there with his head tilted, trying to identify the sound of movement from the basement. We reached the top of the stairs, and I pushed the children behind me, stepping out into the kitchen first. The room was still empty. The footsteps started again, coming closer, and I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of trying to run for the front door, I grabbed the children and pulled them into the small pantry off the kitchen. It was barely large enough for all 4 of us, and I had to press us back against the shelves, holding my hand over Mary's mouth to stifle her whimpering. Through a crack in the pantry door, I watched Frederick enter the kitchen. He moved slowly, methodically, checking every corner like he was hunting something. His face held no expression at all. Not anger, not concern, just a blank mask that was more terrifying than any rage. He walked to the basement door and looked down into the darkness. For a moment, I thought he'd see us, thought it was over. But he just closed the door and turned away, moving back toward the front of the house. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. Then I counted to 10, and we moved. I half-carried, half-dragged the children through the kitchen, down the hallway, praying the floorboards wouldn't creak too loudly. The front door was right there, just a few more feet. That's when Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs. She was coming down, her footsteps careful and quiet, and when she saw us, her eyes went wide. For a terrible moment, I thought she might scream, might call for Frederick, but instead, tears started streaming down her face, and she rushed down the remaining stairs. She didn't speak, just gathered her children against her, touching their faces like she needed to confirm they were real. Then she looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Determination. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. pushing the children ahead of her. We made it to the porch before Frederick realized what was happening. I heard him roar from somewhere inside the house, heard furniture crashing as he rushed toward us. Margaret screamed at me to run, and I grabbed Thomas and Mary while she carried Anne. We ran down the porch steps, into the street, not caring who saw us, not caring about anything except getting away from that house. Frederick appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, I thought he'd chase us. But he just stood there, watching, his face still empty of expression. Then he smiled. That same smile I'd seen at the door, and he slowly closed the door as if nothing unusual had happened. We ran 3 blocks before we stopped, gasping for air, the children crying and clinging to their mother. I looked back toward the Harrigan house, and I swear I could see Frederick watching us from an upstairs window. I knew then that this wasn't over, that he wasn't the kind of man who let things go. We needed help, and we needed it immediately. The police station was 4 blocks away, and we covered the distance in what felt like seconds, bursting through the door with our strange procession. The desk sergeant looked up, annoyed at first, then confused, then horrified, as he took in the state of the children. I told him everything, the words tumbling out so fast they almost ran together, about the basement, about the children, about Frederick Harrigan, and his terrible smile. Within an hour, 6 police officers, including a detective named Morrison, were standing in front of the Harrigan house with a warrant. I watched from across the street as they knocked on the door, as it opened to reveal Frederick, still wearing that smile. I watched as they pushed past him, as they disappeared into the house. What they found in that basement would make headlines across the country for weeks. The children, Thomas, Anne, and Mary, had been kept in that cellar for nearly 4 years. 4 years of living in darkness, fed scraps when their mother could sneak them food, beaten when they made too much noise or asked for light. The walls of the basement told the story. The children had scratched marks into the brick, counting the days at first, then giving up when the numbers became too large to comprehend. They'd written messages to each other when they had nothing else to do. Childish notes about missing the sun and wanting to play outside. They'd even scratched out a calendar, trying to remember birthdays and holidays, though the dates had stopped making sense after the first year. But that wasn't the worst of it. Detective Morrison found evidence that 2 other children had been in that basement before, a boy named William and a girl named Catherine. Frederick's children from a first marriage. Their bodies were found buried in the small garden behind the house, wrapped in canvas and lime. They died of pneumonia and starvation, respectively, and Frederick had buried them in the dead of night rather than risk anyone finding out how they'd lived. The trial began in early December 1907, and I was called to testify about what I'd seen. The courtroom was packed, people crammed into every available space to hear the details of the case. Frederick sat quietly through it all, still wearing that smile, his lawyer arguing that he'd been exercising his legal right to discipline his children as he saw fit. The jury didn't believe it. They convicted him of murder, child abuse, and a dozen other charges after deliberating for less than 2 hours. He was hanged in January 1908, and I didn't attend the execution. I'd seen enough of Frederick Harrigan to last me several lifetimes. Margaret testified against him, telling the court about years of abuse, about how he'd started keeping the children in the basement after his first wife died, about how he'd threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone. She broke down on the stand, sobbing that she'd tried to protect them, tried to feed them and care for them, but that Frederick had watched her constantly, had beaten her when he suspected she was helping them too much. The children, Thomas, Anne, and Mary, recovered slowly. They were placed in a church-run orphanage, while Margaret tried to put her life back together. Thomas, the oldest, struggled the most. Years in the dark had damaged his eyes, left him sensitive to light and partially blind. The younger 2 fared better physically, but the psychological scars ran deep. They had nightmares, terrible dreams that would wake them screaming about being locked in dark places. They flinched at loud noises, at sudden movements, at anything that reminded them of their father. I visited them a few times at the orphanage, bringing sweets and small toys, though I never knew quite what to say. What do you say to children who've lived through something like that? How do you explain to them that the world isn't always dark and cruel, that most people wouldn't do what their father did? Margaret eventually remarried to a kind man who worked as a clerk in a law office. She took the children back and moved to a different part of the city, far from Racine Street, far from any memory of the Harrigan house. I heard she changed their names, gave them a fresh start. I hope they found some measure of peace. The house itself stood empty for years. No one wanted to live in the place where such horrors had occurred. The landlord tried to rent it out, but tenants never stayed long. They complained about strange noises, about the smell that never quite went away, no matter how much they scrubbed. Some said they heard children crying in the basement, even though it was empty. Eventually, the city condemned the building and tore it down, replacing it with a small park. But even now, more than 2 decades later, people in the neighborhood avoid that spot. They call it cursed ground, say that some evils are too great to be completely erased. As for me, I never went back to that part of Chicago. I left Mr. Morton's delivery service and found work on the other side of the city, as far from Racine Street as I could get. But sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind howls the way it did that October in 1907, I still smell that sweet rot. I still hear Margaret's whispered words, "Help them," and I still see Frederick Harrigan's smile, empty and terrible, following me through my dreams. If this story made you feel something, if it made you grateful for the light in your home and the safety of your family, then smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another tale that'll remind you why some history deserves to be remembered, no matter how dark. And seriously, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is there, because I love knowing this story is reaching people everywhere, keeping the memory of those 3 children alive.